Thank you all. Thank you. When we were upstairs before we came down here, I happened to notice there was a piano in the hall, and I thought, well, I better assure these people I only sing in front of Senate committees. It's a delight to be back here. I was walking around Little Rock yesterday, and I hadn't thought about the fact that I had once come here to vet a potential Supreme Court nominee in years. And suddenly I was walking around downtown, and it flashed on me, that memory. And I must say your city has really grown, blossomed, and prospered since those days. It was a nice city then, but it's something to certainly be proud of. What I thought I'd talk about tonight, and I see some young faces out here. I see some people who have a little gray, who they may remember that period of history that I have a lot of expertise about. But I should probably tell those who are too young, the students, to remember who exactly Richard Nixon was in a nutshell. And I've been confronted with this throughout. It started during the primaries, where people started asking me, did I see any similarities between any of the candidates and Richard Nixon? And the first one that struck me was Mitt Romney. And I thought, you know, this is really Richard Nixon on Prozac. But the one that most struck me was Rudy Giuliani, who I'm convinced is Richard Nixon on crystal meth. Not sure where John McCain fits in there yet. I don't see many Nixonian traits there. The books that I have written, what turned out to be a trilogy I had not planned, I had promised myself when I retired as from the business of investment banking, where I'd kept a low profile, that I would return to writing, because I'd enjoyed the two books I had done, and I had, as I say, been in business, and I had lowered my profile considerably. And I started writing some 8 years ago now for first an online publication that I realized when I would publish these pieces on a publication called Find Law, that there was a lot of interest out there in what was really happening. And I had kept my contacts in Washington. Some were in high places, some who, and really I had not been partisan for years, and I don't consider myself a partisan today. But I realized that I did have access to information that wasn't getting out there. So I started cranking out these articles and trying to really understand what in the hell the Bush administration was doing, because I thought we'd written the book on what not to do. And here they were found the first chapter and trying to add their own new set of plays to what had gone wrong. We now, some 8 years later, are seeing the consequences of that. I think it's most unfortunate that someone like Dick Cheney did not learn and pay more attention to what did happen during that era and the consequences of it. I think history will obviously make George Bush responsible for it, but also, as I have analyzed it and looking at it from the very outset, I watched during the transition, and a number of my friends were involved in the transition, and they said the person who is going to be the voice behind the scenes is Dick Cheney. And there's a certain genius to this, no question, because Cheney knows that men with small egos don't run for that office. These are not shrinking violets. But yet he has, as a former chief of staff, as a former cabinet officer, as a former leader on Capitol Hill, knew exactly how to proceed. And his genius is that he has let George Bush wake up every morning for the last some 8 years now, almost now, and actually think he's president. And I say that because, no question, the decider is deciding. And he does that because of the information that Cheney has very astutely figured out what will go into the Oval Office and what will not go into the Oval Office. Cheney also is one of the last to talk to the president before he often makes these decisions. So decisions that were once made in the Oval Office now often don't even get into the Oval Office. The titles I would choose, for example, when I wrote a book called Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush, I was a little reluctant to use that title at the time I used it. But nobody in the mainstream media was talking about the excessive secrecy that was now dominating this new presidency. So I now have had second thoughts about that title and realize it would have been probably better named as Much Worse Than Watergate. Because I, in his darkest moment, can't imagine, for example, Richard Nixon embracing a policy for the military or the CIA that would include torture. I worked with Nixon closely on issues like My Lai, where I knew his personal disgust with what had happened. So I also appreciated his feeling on most even domestic issues that he looked at their foreign implications and how others would look at them. I don't say all this, as I say, as a partisan. I have no particular axe to grind with the Bush administration. I do have an axe to grind with the media that has failed to cover so much of this. And it's only been recently that we've seen something of an evolution in the media where Fox obviously speaks for the right and more increasingly MSNBC and shows like Countdown, which I'm a frequent guest on, try to tell the other side of the story because there are two sides to most stories. It's regretful. But anyway, I felt that this series I did, the first book being The Worse Than Watergate, the second was a book that I had really started actually many years earlier called Conservatives Without Conscience. It was a book I was going to write with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, who I'd known since I'd been about 13 years of age. His son and I were roommates in prep school together. We have remained very close friends. When the senator retired from the Senate and went back to Arizona, Barry Jr. would call me and say, you know, Dad would love to talk to you, John, or you just seem never to stay in touch with him, and I would. And finally, after Bill Clinton was elected, I was having a conversation with Senator Goldwater, and he said, you know, I'm really upset with what's going on with this new president. I said, how so? He said, well, I actually have been going back, and I'm going to go back and make several more trips. I'm going to do Larry King and some other shows, because the conservatives are so viciously attacking him, and for no good reason. They're even attacking the First Lady. And this is just the sort of thing that's going to drive good people out of office. And he said, I think this young president needs to be given a chance and to back off, and rather than try to define him before he's had a chance to even get his feet wet and learn how that office operates is most unfair. And he said, I wish I understood why they're doing it. And as we were talking, he said, you know, maybe we should do a book about this subject. Because I feel, as somebody who brought a lot of these people into the conservative movement, those who are now controlling the Republican Party, many of them I have lost my relationship with because they are very active in their religious right. We argue until both sides are blue in the face. They don't seem to understand that the way the process works, that the nature of politics is compromise. They're unwilling to compromise their positions. It's either their way or no way, and they insist on that, and I keep telling them it will not ever work that way. There has to be accommodation. So we started on a book, and it was because he said to me at one point, he said, John, I think conservatives have lost their conscience. I said, Senator, playing off your classic, The Conscience of a Conservative, that would make an interesting title, Conservatives Without Conscience. So we started on the book. Unfortunately, his health did not hold up, and I realized the project could become a burden because he was getting interested in it. And so I said, well, let's put this on the shelf till you're feeling better. That didn't happen. He did not feel better and would pass away in 1998. This is before I had turned really to full-time writing and had retired from my investment banking career, where I knew I could afford to live comfortably and still be a writer, having no idea that these books would ever become the series of bestsellers that they have become. One of the things the senator said also, he said, do look at my papers before you write, and I did, and that not only would help me to write Conservatives Without Conscience, but I most recently did a book based on a diary that he kept unbeknownst to his biographers, unbeknownst to his family, unbeknownst to everybody, that he had started on a portable typewriter, not daily, but fairly regularly. There are segments where he goes every day for many days. But after electronic dictation equipment becomes available, he dictates. He's a pilot. He's checked out in 250 different airplanes, and often when flying, and he's on automatic pilot and got that time down and his mind is working, he would dictate his thoughts, other times as a passenger. So it was a fascinating collection and a chance to really revisit him in a way that I had never expected. But the Conservatives Without Conscience, he wasn't available to see what I did discover as to this, really what I believe, and he would have, I think, agreed, has happened to the Republican Party and why they have gone the route they have gone. There is a very small but dominant segment that is the core of the party that can only be described as authoritarian conservatives. And I came across that definition when I was trying to understand actually the personalities of many of the people I had worked with in the Nixon White House, many of the people I had known in the conservative movement. And I discovered that up in Berkeley, in the aftermath of World War II, a group of social scientists were very concerned about whether the United States might ever go the same direction as, say, Italy and Germany under Mussolini and Hitler. Do we have that kind of disposition? Could this country ever indeed be so swayed by a dictator to actually, in a sense, democratically put him into office and then let him take that turn? The long and short of that study, which was published initially in 1952, was, yes, there is something called an authoritarian personality that very easily follows a strong leader. Once they buy into the worldview of that leader and his positions, they become very defensive and protective of it. They're typically highly religious people. They're both men and women. They are often fairly abusive with people who don't see the world as they see it. They become very defensive of their position and don't want to have anything jeopardize their own thinking and the conclusions they've reached. It is clearly a very conspicuous personality type, and I did indeed recognize many of my former colleagues in the Nixon White House when I began looking at this material. The interesting thing is the initial study was rightly criticized because it was largely based on Freudian psychology, which has its own set of problems. But in the years since 1952, when this was first published, I discovered there had been a literal mountain of additional research that had been done by a host of social scientists, primarily, excuse me, psychologists and political psychologists, and they have now had collected a half-century of empirical data based on interviewing tens upon tens of thousands of people to find that this is clearly a very definite personality type. And when I describe all this in the book, I didn't do it to be pejorative, but rather to be descriptive, because it explained to me, it was one of the most revelatory books I wrote to understand what had happened to the Republican Party I once knew, why they didn't want anybody who was a moderate or who didn't think exactly the way they thought. If they didn't think, for example, that the issue of gay marriage or abortion or school prayer should be front and center and the most dominant issue, many of them didn't even want you in the party. My friends who are economic conservatives, typically business people, who have long been Republicans and don't feel these issues should be front and center, there's a true and not as hidden battle going on amongst these factions within conservatism, and it may well result in the Republicans imploding come November, because this is a part of the problem of keeping the McCain campaign going in a smooth and organized way, given the internal frictions that are existing in this party today. Anyway, as I say, this was the second, and then to pull all this together, to see what had happened, I wrote Broken Government, because I was so struck at what had happened to each of the branches under the rule, and I use rule as opposed to governing very deliberately. Ruling is pretty easy. It's an exercise of power. Governing is an art form. It is much more sophisticated, much more difficult. And Republicans have shown themselves very good at ruling, not terribly good at governing, when the authoritarian conservative is the dominant card player in the, or calling the shots in the party. So I looked at what had happened. I looked at what happened, for example, when they were controlling the Congress. And those who happen to read this book will find a lot of this was really flushed out and developed during the Clinton administration, when Newt Gingrich had managed to take control of the Congress after 40 years of the Democrats controlling it, and then thinking he could go one-on-one with the president, and realizing that he was out of his league when the president he decided to go one-on-one with, and realizing that not only could they not prevail from the legislative branch, but they needed, indeed, this is when they became even increasingly focused on building a stronger presidency once they would get control of the presidency. But anyway, the legislative branch under Republicans was striking to me. I'm somebody who started my political career on Capitol Hill. I was the chief minority counsel of the House Judiciary Committee, and it's a very vital committee. In fact, I was just talking recently with John Conyers, who's the chairman of the committee now, and John came to the committee while I was still the chief minority counsel, and we have remained in rapport all these many years. And he wanted some of my suggestions about what they might do now that they've been in power 1 year, and I wasn't hesitant to share them with him as to what he might do. When the Republicans controlled the Congress, though, we saw all efforts at oversight over the Bush-Cheney administration ended. They ran a 2.5-day work week. They'd come in on Tuesday afternoons, go home on Thursdays. Newt Gingrich told them, don't even bother to move your family to Washington. Keep your wife and kids back home. And this would have a huge impact on Congress. Once Congress was very collegial because they went to the same churches, their children went to the same schools, they played on the same Little League teams, and it was pretty hard to demonize and attack somebody who you would see in church or on the Little League field. And this is the beginning of the breakdown of the collegial nature of that House. In fact, I was back in Washington through the duration of the Clinton impeachment proceedings. I had spent more time back there at that particular time than in all the preceding 25-some years. MSNBC came to me and asked me because this was just as I was coming out and starting to write and had started doing a few television shows, and one night in a show that Keith Olbermann had called The Big Show, he asked me, well, if this ever went to impeachment, what would that mean? This was long before it had really developed anything close to impeachment, but as an avocational undertaking one summer, many years preceding that, I sat down and read the entire congressional record of the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson from the House proceedings through the Senate. It was just something that caught my attention and my fancy, so when Keith asked that question, he hit a button where he just got a flow of information that kind of overwhelmed him. And before I got out of the studio that night, his producer came on and said, listen, if this thing ever did go to impeachment, would you come back to Washington as an anchor buddy? I said, a what? They said, an anchor buddy. Well, I had not a clue what an anchor buddy was. I would find out very quickly. An anchor buddy is somebody who sits on the set under the hot Klieg lights all day long, The anchors change. It would be Tom Brokaw, it would be John Siegenthaler, it would be Brian Williams. But the anchor buddy stays there and stays aware of what's happening generally. In case the anchor has nobody out in the field to talk to, he turns to the anchor buddy and expects the anchor buddy to give some lucid commentary. So it's something you must follow fairly closely. And one of the places I was able to follow a lot, and indeed was a fascinating place to be, was the green room of the MSNBC studio, because anybody who was really involved in those proceedings at any significant level sooner or later came to the green room. And I was stunned at some of their comments, where some of them who had not a clue where I was coming from, because I wasn't coming from any place in particular, and rather my role as an anchor buddy was just to call it sort of, here's what's going on now, here's what's likely to happen, process discussion, if you will. And they would tell me things like, John, this is payback. This is payback. We're going to do to the Clinton administration what the Democrats did to the Nixon administration. This is payback. Amazing things. I would talk to them, for example, as some of the votes approached, and I said, is this a conscience vote? Now, we recently had a lot of public discussion about conscience votes during the bailout, where both sides said that members of their party were free to vote their conscience. So when I raised this back during the Clinton impeachment votes, I was told no by all Republicans that this is no conscience vote. In fact, if you don't vote for impeachment and everything that leads in that direction, not only will you likely never get another cent out of the House Republican Campaign Committee, we may find a primary opponent for you next year who will contest your seat for you, where you'll badly need that money. So it was purely political. It was payback. It was an effort to cause as much havoc, I was told, for the Clinton presidency as they could cause, and they had been causing already a lot before that, to try to do it and to tarnish him just because they had the power to do it. This is Republican rule. This is not the way the process is designed. This isn't what impeachment was designed for. It's clearly one of the reasons that Nancy Pelosi has not taken this out of the chest during what are some clear and serious high crimes and misdemeanors that have occurred during the Bush administration, going to war in in Iraq without there being, he might like to go back, Cheney probably like to go back and fight that war too. But without weapons of mass destruction and misleading people about the nature of the evidence that there were such weapons. So I looked at that. That's the first part of broken government, where I look at what Republican rule does. And what people don't understand today, and they say, well, the Congress, John, isn't doing much better today under the Democrats than it was under the Republicans. They're not producing anything. Well, people don't realize what's happening. The House has been cranking out major legislation, 80, 90, maybe 100 bills now have been sent over to the Senate, important things. And they're being quietly bottled up by the Senate through procedural techniques, threats of filibuster, where they don't have 60 votes to push it on to the floor of the Senate, blocks, where any member can say, I would like to have you defer attention on that until I remove my hold on it. There are all kinds of techniques that are stopping the Democrats from accomplishing anything. This is how Newt Gingrich originally captured the Congress from the Democrats, by these types of procedural moves, gaming the system, and they're doing it again. I'm only disappointed that Pelosi and Reid don't go on television every night and tell Americans the reason nothing's happening here is because the Republicans are holding this up. They refuse to pass this legislation and just go through it chapter and verse as to what is bottled up, because it's staggering. So that's why they're not doing very well. And this, indeed, is not the sort of sophisticated thing that people get into to understand, why things are working or not. As far as the executive branch, I could never have envisioned that another presidency would try to go beyond Nixon's imperial presidency. Bush and Cheney have taken the concept of the imperial presidency, shot it full of steroids, and put it up on stilts where it can barely move around. It's so muscle-bound and so overpowerful, and so unnecessarily so. It did come up a couple times during the primaries where the Democratic contenders were asked if they would do anything about all these excessive powers that have been accumulated in the last few years under this presidency, where executive orders have been written that are literally just repealing laws, and you don't have that power as the president to repeal laws. Everything, this being a presidential library, and Skip and I were talking just before we came in about when Bush first came in, he repealed the 1978 Presidential Records Act for all practical purposes through an executive order. He made it so past presidents, after they had left office, and vice presidents could invoke executive privilege long after they had left to protect their papers. In fact, Bush got it down to just about where Barney can invoke executive privilege and stop somebody from getting his papers. I don't think this is going to survive. It's not going to last. It was an obscene overturning of the law, a law that was carefully and strenuously resolved by a truly bipartisan process, and was satisfactory to all presidents until Bush arrived there. So it worked under Reagan, it worked under Clinton, and there was no reason to do this excepting this effort to indeed remove all transparency from the executive branch. They have concocted a theory called the so-called unitary executive theory that really was something that was begun in the Reagan administration. People first heard of this so-called unitary executive theory during the confirmation period proceedings of Alito, where it was mentioned, where he had been giving speeches about it. It's a theory that makes the president all-powerful. Indeed, under the commander-in-chief clause, he trumps the courts, he trumps the Congress, and indeed it is a rather frightening prospect that if it were ever to get much further than it has gotten. The judicial branch is the last branch I deal with, and I'm going to deal with only briefly here so we can open this up to a Q&A, is to me in many ways the most troubling. I say that because I tracked back to the Nixon presidency. As mentioned, I was down here vetting in Little Rock as after Nixon had lost his efforts to get, for example, Judge Hainsworth and Carswell nominated. I'm not sure on later reflection that he really would have wanted Carswell to be on the court. It would have given him the unique distinction of having selected the first blatantly homosexual on the court, because Mr. Carswell would later be found in a men's room in Tallahassee doing indecent behavior. But there was no vetting done whatsoever of Carswell. J. Edgar Hoover took these things over personally and would conduct the FBI background check. His background check on Carswell was to call an agent in charge in the South that had known Carswell for a number of years. Said, "What do you think of him?" Hoover was told, "This guy's a good supporter of the FBI." That was all Hoover needed, and he was given the blessings and passed forward. But that's about the time, as I say, that the staff, Nixon wanted his White House counsel to go around and visit with these people, and it was really quite an interesting assignment. We can talk about that more later. But the point I want to get to and wrap up on is what's happened after Nixon politicized the Supreme Court appointment and selection process. He made it a campaign issue in '68, where he promised he would appoint strict constructionist judges. And this is a meaningless term. It is we at one point sent a memo over to Bill Rehnquist, who was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, to say, what is a strict construction as judge? Rehnquist, to give it to you in a nutshell, came back and said a strict construction as judge is a judge who favors criminal prosecutors in criminal proceedings and favors defendants in civil rights actions. That's a pretty sorry definition of what you think about it as to what a strict construction as judge might be. So Nixon starts a process that has carried through with every Republican president since, where they have been very political in their selection of judges and justices. Ironically, the Democrats have not done the same. They have, for example, President Clinton, he appointed, when he had two opportunities, very much too centrist. He decided he didn't want to spend whatever political capital was necessary, but put good judges on there, Breyer and Ginsburg, and they are truly, there is no liberal on the court today. It is dominated by conservatives. That doesn't trouble me in itself. What troubles me, you have four justices right now in Scalia, Thomas, the new Chief Justice, Roberts, and Alito, that I describe and explain in some detail in the book, are fundamentalist. They look upon the Constitution much differently than a normal conservative judge might. Sandra Day O'Connor is a conservative. Kennedy, is the swing judge, is a conservative. In a sense, even Breyer and Souter and the others have a conservative streak about them. So the court is basically conservative. The fundamentalist judge would so change the law of the land in a way that I don't think many Americans understand and appreciate. And when I go into these sort of things, I've got a wonderful first editor, my wife Mo. When I write this stuff, I always send it to her first to look at it, because she will say, John, that's too much lawyer talk. That's too much like a textbook. So I track through what exactly could happen to this court if we get one more fundamentalist judge. And John McCain has made it very clear that if he gets openings, and it's very likely there will be 2, if not 3 appointments to the next court, he has made it very clear that he will put a Scalia, Thomas, Roberts, Alito type judge there. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that they will so change the law in a way that the political branches could never change it, that I don't think Americans have any grasp of what that would mean to their daily life. And it would seriously change your daily life, and not for the better. So with those cheery notes, and, and I happen to be a glass half full person, as we can talk about, let's just open up and have some exchange of questions and answers so I can find out what's on your mind.
You know, do we have microphones around? Yes, okay, right here. Okay, right there. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you for coming. Two questions, or one interrelated question. I was fascinated to learn that Mr. Rove worked for Mr. Segretti during the Watergate era. Question one is, did you know him then? And second, would you talk a little bit about the influence of Rove and his disciples on the McCain campaign, and I would argue now not a very successful influence on the McCain campaign? Thank you.
Yeah, the first time I ever heard the name Karl Rove, believe it or not, was when one of the top prosecutors in the Watergate Special Prosecution Force asked me, did I know Karl Rove? So he got picked up in their radar. I didn't know him. I don't believe he worked for Segretti that I've ever been able to really determine. They may have met, but he was really never involved. This question, when I actually went back and looked, was asked of several people in the re-election committee if they knew Rove. And I found nobody who really did. But for some reason, the Watergate Prosecution Office had taken a look at him. I've never really looked at those files to see what they found, but it's kind of unusual that that many years ago that he first, his activities were noticed. What's his influence on the McCain campaign, well, we know one of his deputies is now running the day-to-day operations of the campaign, Steve Schmidt, and we saw a definite change in the nature of that campaign when Schmidt arrived and took over for the day-to-day operations for Davis. It went negative, it went ugly, it became a somewhat disorganized campaign. He's not as talented as Karl Rove, for sure, but I have a feeling that Karl has his access right into that campaign and is giving them their advice, his advice and counsel. It's very telling about a campaign, too, in the modern presidency, because a campaign tells you very much about the way a president will govern. Typically, the campaigns go right on into the White House and just pick up, and there's been something of a permanent campaign for most presidents and newly elected presidents. The campaign that McCain has run has been, to me, a disaster. I'm very curious to see what happens tonight in the debates. I'm very curious to see if the John McCain, who I might have considered in 2000 actually voting for, but I can't even find that individual anymore. I had some interesting material in the Goldwater book that I put in. I found a lot of material on McCain because Goldwater had helped McCain win his seat to the Senate. And I was curious about why that was so. And the more I dig and I dug and I talked to a number of people on the Goldwater staff, and he initially, when McCain married Cindy Hemsley and moved to Arizona, he thought he was a carpetbagger. And really, while he knew his father-in-law, he didn't do much to really help, but he didn't oppose it. And he did later. Some Democrats, some Republicans that came out, one, for example, a guy named Doug Weed from the religious right came out and tried to win another seat out there after he'd retired and was calling himself a Goldwater conservative and Goldwater Republican, and the senator answered that by coming out and endorsing his Democratic opponent, a woman by the name of Karen English, and she won. But when I looked to see how his feelings towards McCain, because particularly since McCain had written how in his memoirs how much he tried to win the heart and mind of Barry Goldwater and felt somewhat rejected that he never had. It's clear to me in talking to the staff that most thought the senator had concluded that this man was pretty much just an opportunist. I did put some correspondence in the book to when Goldwater first writes a letter to supporters to tell them that he endorses McCain winning his Senate seat. He didn't do that, however, I can tell you, for John McCain. He did it for John McCain's father, Admiral Jack McCain, with whom he had a very close relationship and with whom he was very fond. And I have speculated and publicly that if Goldwater were still alive today, McCain would have never gotten that nomination. I really believe that. While he was a party man, he would not have liked where McCain has gone to get the nomination, and he would have fought that. Question, yes.
Right here. Go, Lee.
Thank you for being here. You talked about Senator Goldwater's concern in 1993 that Bill Clinton was being already defined by other people in a way that would limit his ability to be effective. If indeed Senator Obama is elected president in November, what can he do? Will he experience the same kind of external definition, and what are his options to avoid that?
Wonderful question. I just got off about noon, I was doing a radio program. I was to do it with Ron Reagan Jr., who had to cancel, and we all know why he had to cancel, because his mother broke her hip. Apparently, she'd actually been, while it was only announced that she was in the hospital today, she's been there 2 or 3 days. She is not in threatening condition, but he was obviously very concerned, so they had a substitute. And after we did the show, we got to talking about this very issue, that it's something that everybody should be vigilant and prepared to address and be aware is very likely to happen. If Barack Obama wins, the right is going to try to destroy him before he can become an effective president. No question. The Rush Limbaughs, the Sean Hannitys, this crowd who could give a hoot about what's best for America. It's what's best for their base and their own narrow view of how America should operate. They're going to do exactly what they tried to do to Bill Clinton. The fact that Bill Clinton was able to accomplish what he did, given the attacks he was under, is stunning. It's stunning. It's also an interesting thing that when I reflect on this, it shows the difference between the Republicans and Democrats when there is divided government. Clinton, of course, had the first 2 years, he had a Democratic Congress. But he also had a Democratic Congress that has something called institutional pride, and they continued their oversight as they had done with Lyndon Johnson, they'd done with Jimmy Carter, and they did with Bill Clinton. They actually fulfill their constitutional roles, which is something that makes it very difficult for presidents. But I think it makes it better in the long run for most Americans that those checks and balances be in existence. But it's another typical comparison. When I tell people, they say the Democrats do the same thing that Republicans do when both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue are controlled by the same party. I said, not true. History doesn't bear that out. So that's a wonderful question. I don't have the answer. It's something I am actively thinking about, I'm talking to people about, because I think that there needs to be, come November 5th, not only alerting people to this likely to happen, but some sort of counter plans, so that this man is not, indeed, if he wins, he's not beat up so badly he can't even govern by the time he gets to Washington, or he's not beat on so badly once he's in Washington that he can't effectively govern. It's something we have to be aware of, because that's the way the authoritarian conservative operates.
All right, we have a question right here.
Thank you for the books that you've written. They've been very informative for those of us who want to be global citizens. My question is that with the transparency that you have shared with us as it relates to the conservatives, is there a John Dean in China, Japan, or the Middle East that's looking at this same transparency, and what does that impact possibly mean for the survival of America?
If I understand your question, is there somebody who's likely to do what I did or has already done it? Well, as close as I can tell you, and I couldn't wish anybody to find themselves in the situation I found myself in, but I first internally tried to tell people that some of this stuff was pure insanity. When I heard, for example, that a fellow who'd been assigned to my staff by the name of Jack Caulfield came into my office one day wide-eyed. Jack is a former New York City detective. These people aren't disturbed by much. They've seen most everything you could ever want to see. But Jack came in and said, John, Chuck Colson, another Nixon aide, has just ordered me to firebomb the Brookings Institute. I said, what? Firebomb the Brookings Institute? Why? Well, the president thinks they've got a copy of the so-called Pentagon Papers, which had recently been leaked, the study of the origins of the Vietnam War, and they weren't likely to turn them over, so he wanted to have somebody go in and firebomb the place. Once that had happened, send a team of burglars in to crack the safe, and then come out with the papers. And I said, Jack, please, do nothing. Do nothing. I'm on my way to California, where the president is, with the senior staff. And I flew on the next courier flight out, met the next morning with Ehrlichman, told him this insanity. By then I'd pulled the code down off the book, off the shelf, and realized that arson in the District of Columbia that results in a and a death is a capital crime. And I said, John, I said, this is just pure insanity. So he picked up the telephone, got Colston on the line, and said, Chuck, young Counsel Dean is out here, doesn't think this Brookings plan is a very good idea, so call it off. A few weeks later, another Ehrlichman aide would come by and said, John, I wish I could talk to you, because I would need to talk to somebody about this special investigations unit that I've been asked to set up. It would later become known as the Plumbers Unit. Why was it called the Plumbers Unit? Well, Krog's partner was a Kissinger aide by the name of David Young. David Young, shortly after they had set this up, went home for Thanksgiving, and his grandmother asked him, David, what are you doing? And he said, well, grandmother, the president is concerned about the leaks that are coming out of the White House, and we've been asked to track down the leaks. And she said, oh, you're a plumber, are you, David? And he said that name kind of stuck after that. They were a little bit more than plumbing, though. So after Krog came back and told me he was setting up this special investigations unit, he said, I'm not allowed to talk to you about this, John. I said, why is that? He said, well, your trip to California to call off what had been brewing made people think there's a lot of little old lady in you. And they don't want anybody sharing what we're doing here. And so it wasn't really until after Watergate and everything fell apart that I learned of all these activities and how they had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, which really became the reason they were covering up Watergate, which was another bungled burglary, because that tracked right back to the White House. So all these things sort of just fell together. So is there anybody who's likely to blow the whistle on this? It's not a route I could recommend to anybody. It's very unpleasant, very painful. What I had to do is, as I say, internally, I tried at every time I learned of some of this sheer madness. I mean, can you imagine firebombing the Brookings Institute? I mean, it is insane. It's as insane as sending 5 men with rubber surgical gloves into the Democratic headquarters. When you tape the door in the basement to get in, the night patrolman removes the tape and you put it back on again so he sees it the second time and calls the police. I mean, these are not professionals. That's a lot of people don't understand the utter stupidity of Watergate and that break-in. They think these people were highly professional operatives who were looking for and had all this carefully planned out and knew what they were doing. This is just not true. Gordon Liddy and his team were terrible bunglers. Liddy, who sees himself as a James Bond character, isn't really quite Maxwell Smart. So I don't know if there is anybody who's ever going to have to travel the route I did. When I did it so, I tried to warn the president first. I had, at one point told him there was a cancer on his presidency. He would then build his defense around that conversation. I knew very well that he knew much more than that he was pretending he knew as of that date. When the tapes came out, showed that defense was a lie, that he indeed had been informed within 24 hours of the break-in what had happened. He's got his hands all over sending the CIA to block the FBI from further investigating things. And there were so many chances where Nixon, and I believed this even when I broke rank, that if he would have come forward and he said, hey, here's what I did, here's how I screwed up, here's what my aides did that made mistakes, they're all ready to stand up and account for themselves, and we're going to end this thing, he would have survived. He never trusted Americans enough to do that. I have not seen anybody in the Bush administration. Scott McClellan will probably not get Christmas cards from the Bushes, but he hasn't said much in that book either, where he wrote about the fact he didn't like the way Iraq had turned out. But Richard Clark, who came over from the Clinton years and didn't like what he was seeing, didn't wasn't shy about speaking out, and he knew it was going to cost him his job, and he was somebody who was very valuable there to be there for the war on terror. So I'm not encouraged, and may it be in the next administration that we don't need anybody who's willing to come forward and talk about what's gone astray.
Question. Right. Let's see. There's one right by you, Bob. No.
Would you comment on the backlog of judicial nominees that are being held up by committee? You know, they say they should be allowed to go to an up or down vote in the Senate. How do you look at that?
With some mixed emotion, it's less than fair to a nominee by any definition to have him nominated, go through the process of getting up there. Some people not even getting hearings, and I don't think it's fair to say that this all started with the Republicans pulling these tricks and then the Democrats seeing who could one up. It's been a game that's going back and forth. It is a way to, in a less than embarrassing way, to defeat a nomination. Now that the Democrats control the Senate, they probably have enough votes to block anybody they did not want to put on, so I think they could indeed and should be entitled to up and down votes both at the committee level and on the floor level. I think it's unfair to a nominee, and some have withdrawn for that reason because they don't want that agony. But again, it may be saving face for some people who would have an embarrassing vote should it come to the floor.
Question right here. Yeah, here's the microphone coming at you.
Mr. Dean, did you know that Mark Felt was deep throat?
I didn't know he was deep throat. I was one of those who wasted a lot of time sleuthing around to see who was who was deep throat, much to Bob Woodward, my friend's chagrin, who said, "I wish you'd let this thing go." When Felt did surface, well, first of all, there's no way, if you honestly follow every clue in All the President's Men, you can arrive at Felt. And that's true for one principal reason. Watergate occurs on June 17th of 1972. Woodward has his first conversation with Deep Throat on June 19th of 1972. His last conversation, reported in the book, All the President's Men, is in the first week of November of 1973. This is one of the most interesting tips he gets, is the last one. And it's that one or more of Nixon's secret tapes has erasures. The problem with it is, and there's another earlier conversation in May where there's sort of an information drop, if you will, where Deep Throat just unloads a ton of information. The problem is that Mark Felt has left the FBI long before November. He leaves in early May of 73. So there's no way, and I have looked from the record and talked to all the people, excepting those who might be deceased, but particularly my later successor, Len Garment, with whom I have a lovely relationship, and he and I are good friends. And Len has told me, so few people, that was held so close that the fact that Rose thought she had erased one or more tapes, that there's no way the FBI even could have known. So this is where I always had trouble with Felt, that he couldn't have access to that information. Woodward's never been able to explain how that is true. It's one of the few stories where they seem to accidentally mention that all their sources are from the White House in the way they structured the story. So that's why I always eliminated Felt. We actually knew Felt was leaking. There's a fascinating tape where I have come back and told Bob Haldeman, the Chief of Staff, that I've been told by Henry Peterson, the head of the criminal division, who's been contacted by a private attorney for the Washington Post, that they're worried they might somehow get caught up in an obstruction of justice because Mark Felt is leaking to the Washington Post. So we knew this information, that he was a key informational source. And when I tell, the tape is interesting because it was initially, and still the extant copy is mistranscribed. But one of the archivists called me and tipped me off, who had listened to it, and said, John, why don't you listen to that tape too and see what you hear? And there's one section where after Haldeman repeats what I have told him from Peterson, and Nixon and he are talking about, well, what do we do about this guy Felt? And Nixon at one point just says, well, you know what I do, Bob, about Felt? Son of a bitch. That's the way the transcript reads. Because obviously the person who did the transcribing couldn't hear it. When I went back and listened to it, what Nixon says, you know what I would do, Bob? An ambassadorship. Big difference. An ambassadorship is what Richard Helms got from the CIA to ease him out, where he would be very quiet and very compliant when he was sent to Iran. So this is what Nixon was thinking about if this thing escalated, was to give Felt an ambassadorship, which, as I say, is much different than the way that the person heard it. So I didn't know it was Felt. I'm deeply disappointed as Mark Felt, frankly. Mark Felt his motives are very clear. He was trying to ease Pat Gray out of becoming director of the FBI. He wanted the job for himself. He had an agenda. He's trying to hurt the acting director so he won't become a permanent director. And I had always hoped that Deep Throat would have a little bit more noble motive than being annoyed that he hadn't gotten the nod.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to John Dean.
Thank you.